Hey everybody, this is Larry with Leading Edge Industrial, and welcome to our third in a three-part series on creating defined sketches. What we did in the first video is we just created a simple gasket, a square gasket with some holes, and defined some of that geometry out and showed you why we should go about doing that. The second one was creating a simple revolve based on our spindle pulley for our CNC mill. And then this last one, this is a part for one of the projects we're going to be doing on our mill in our lathe series. And this is for a steam engine, or it'll actually be an air engine here. However, this was created by a new engineer at our shop, and it's a perfect example of why we should create well-defined sketches. That's not to pick on the engineer, that's to show this is all used as training. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back through his drawing. What better way to learn it than to take a drawing you've done, you know intimately, and then apply some of the rules that I've developed over 20 years. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down each one of these sketch elements here. We're going to make them a little bit simpler, as well as get rid of some of the redundant geometry, as well as some of the orphan geometry, and make sure that everything's fully constrained. You'll see the reason for creating defined geometry immediately in the first sketch here. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's select the sketch, right click on it, and say edit sketch. One of the first things that I notice here is that the sketch isn't fully defined, but if you look up here at the top, we also have a black line and two blue lines on the other side. That's an immediate attention grabber, because what that means is that these are all separate lines, and that there could be smaller, shorter lines underneath each other, which creates orphan geometry. Now the problem with orphan geometry is, see right here, if you can come down here, there was one of these lines here that you could see that was only a partial line. So is this dimension to this line here, or is it to that smaller orphan geometry? So the first thing that we're going to do is kind of show you what we're talking about as far as somebody makes a change. Well, what happens if I come over here and I change the dimension of this part here? As you can see, I lost my tangency relationship here with this arc, and now there's really no easy way to put that back together. So let's go ahead and hit undo. The other thing is we can grab some of these lines and we can actually stretch them out along the way. See, now that's going to create havoc for some of your design intents, isn't it? You change one part and then all of a sudden all the other relations go out the window. So let's go ahead and undo that as well. And we're just going to break them down really simple. I like to use the shortcut keys. Look down in the comments section below for the shortcut key map, and download that and use it. A couple other things that I want to point out here is we're going to change some of this geometry. If it's not geometry that you're using to create geometry, or a sketch element that you're using to create geometry, make sure you define that as a construction line. Let's make these lines here construction lines. Select them all and hit X. Now they're all construction lines. A couple other things that we're going to notice here is that some of these geometry, they're very redundant, and it looks to me like everything is symmetric. We could define another line right down the middle here. Just snap it to a midpoint on this section here and a midpoint up here at the top. And now let's create that as a construction line by selecting and hitting X. And now we're going to get rid of all of these dimensions on this side here, since this is going to be symmetric with the other side. We'll create relations between each one of those lines. The next thing is, let's go ahead and dimension out this slot here. Looks 1.5, so we'll leave that at 1.5, and then let's go ahead and apply that tangency constraint here. So now that locks that down a little bit. This circle here is not locked down in any way, shape, or form, so what we'll want to do is we'll want to snap that to this line. Create a coincident. Oh, we want to define this arc isn't defined as it doesn't have a dimension to it. So let's go ahead and grab the D for dimension key, and then let's give that a dimension. Lock that in place at 0.5. So now we've got some of that locked in. some of this stuff will start locking down as we lock down some of this upper geometry. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of some of this orphan geometry up here at the top. And in order to do that, we have to delete the solid line at the top, and you'll see line segments here. We don't ever want to create separate line segments. We want to create one line and then base our geometry off of that line, because we can always dimension it, or as you'll see, we'll create symmetric relations between those. So let's go ahead and delete these lines. See what I was talking about there with that line that was underneath the line? We had a shorter segment right here and a longer segment on top. Well, if you create a dimension, are you dimensioning to that line, this line segment, or are you dimensioning to this line? Because you're only grabbing an endpoint in many cases. So we want to reduce the chance of error by always getting rid of our orphan geometry. So we'll go through and we'll delete all of these sketches here. This is just for the dimension here, so we're going to move that in so we understand that that's a dimension line and we're not trying to delete that later. Once again, get rid of all of our orphan lines. And again, that's a dimension line here. And we can actually get rid of that because we don't need that to be, that's 0.469. Let's make this a little bit closer to the end here. So hit D, dimension, do 0.469. Enter. Okay, so first thing we want to do is let's create a line from endpoint to endpoint. To replace that line, we'll snap all of these points, these endpoints on the line to that line, and then we'll start applying our symmetric constraints to it. Okay, so let's select L for line and go from endpoint to endpoint. Now the next thing we want to do is make sure all of these points end up on that line. Let's redefine those points, coincident points. So do that. And in doing that, it also created a perpendicular definition there. So the next thing that we want to do is make these lines all equal. If they're the same size line, we want to make those equal so we don't have to dimension all of them. We can just change one dimension and now they all change. So now we've got this all section here locked down. You can grab those points and drag them around and they don't move. So what we want to do next is we want to grab, let's make a midpoint constraint here between this line and the top line. Now we've got our midpoint constraint, and now we're going to add symmetric constraints between all of these lines here. So let's do our symmetry. And we're going to select our line, our endpoints, and the middle line. And you can see as we do this, it's locking down all of our geometry. Now the very last thing that we've got to do is we've got to lock down this geometry. And in order to do that, as you can see, as we're moving this line up, you can see this center point here moves. So that means the center point's not coincident or collinear with this line here on the bottom. So let's go ahead and let's hit undo and get that brought back down. And then let's just go with our let's do a collinear. We're going to select this line here. It may not let us do collinear because it's not a line to a line, so we'll do coincident. So we'll select the endpoint and that line, and this endpoint and that line. And now you see our entire sketch is locked down. We can grab anywhere and we're not going to move it around. So let's go ahead and hit stop sketch, and you'll see it looks exactly the same as it did before, only we simplified things a little bit and applied some constraints that make it easier to design. And what we're going to do is we're just going to march through each surface here and do the same thing with the other sketches. If there's something that I need to draw your attention to, then I will. We'll do this in double time. D for dimension, go from the top to the center here, make make that 188, hit enter. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create it, since that was along the midpoint, there's no reason to dimension that if you can make a midpoint constraint. That way if you decide to go with a thicker material later on, it's always defined off the midpoint of that line. Same thing with sketch number 4. It looks like it's dead in the middle here. Simplest way to do that is to leave this dimension driving right here. See if we can move that around a little bit. So what we want to do is we want to do line, snap it to the midpoint here, so we're exactly straight across. Select that line, hit X to turn it in. Select midpoint constraint. I want to select the center point here and that line, and now we're good to go. Stop sketch. We're ready to go. I'll go down to sketch number 5, edit sketch. Again, this is all midpoint constraints based on our the bottom geometry. So rather than defining with dimensions, this should just be a line straight across and snap to that line on that center point. Or you could do a diagonal line. It'd still line up on the center point. So right now we're just going to delete this geometry. We're going to move these circles off here. The other thing is we're going to delete one of these dimensions. Since both circles are the same size, let's create an equal relationship between them, so we only have to change one dimension. Bring that dimension outside the circle so you can see it outside the circle. And then we're just going to sketch a line from midpoint to midpoint. And sometimes it'll let you select the geometry, other times it won't. So just sketch a line longer than the geometry is. Select that line, hit delete, and then what we'll do is we'll hit a midpoint constraint. Select both those lines, turn them into construction geometry. Hit X, and then select this point, create a midpoint constraint, and we're good to go. Stop sketch, and now that's a well-defined sketch. Everything is locked down. We don't have to worry about if we come in and we change anything. Then when we go into production, we can go through and we can change dimensions on one half, since on this half over here, since everything was symmetrical, we can change one dimension on one side and it'll propagate through. Defining some of the circles as being the same size without having to have multiple dimensions. Anytime you can do that, saves you work, as well as saves you from having to go back and make 3 and 4 changes versus other ones. This dimension down here, we'll notice that since we cleaned up the top rail sketch, you remember that line that we deleted up here? Well, there was a surface that was based off of that, and that surface was selected to create geometry. So what we'll have to do is come down here, right click on this, and say redefine sketch plane, and then reselect that top plane. Say OK, and our error should go away. There you go. Now we can save that, and we know that this part, sketch defined, is defined, and we can go ahead and put that into production. Alright, so I hope this helps, and if you have any questions and comments, please leave them below in the comments section. Click like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of our videos, and I look forward to seeing you more on our website here. Thanks. Bye.